There's never been another superhero movie as epic as Avengers Infinity War, so it's time to look into everything that went into crafting this blockbuster, from the sheer scale of the star-studded production to the improvised line or two. And stay tuned to find out which one of your favourite Marvel heroes survived the snap off screen. The Road to War. According to writers Christopher Markus and Stephen McFeely, work on the Infinity War script started around January 2016. The story went through several iterations before arriving at what we saw, including versions written well before Thor Ragnarok and Black Panther were completed. That means a lot of changes had to be made to Infinity War, from small omissions to major structural shifts. Howard the Duck originally made a brief reappearance. Thor bantered a little more with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Extra backstory for the Black Order was included. And we even almost saw a destructive sequence on Xandar in which Thanos claims the Power Stone. But perhaps most intriguing of these changes involved Steve Rogers, whose role in the final cut was already pretty limited. Markus and McFeely noted on Infinity War's commentary that in one version of the film, Cap didn't show up until the moment he saves Vision from Corvus Glaive in Wakanda, well into the final act.
And then after we read the draft, we did conclude we were all insane.
An epic production. Infinity War's story spans multiple planets and several continents on Earth, features dozens of speaking roles, and a range of massive set pieces which takes us from Edinburgh to Wakanda to Titan. It stands to reason that the production would be nothing short of massive too, and the numbers don't disappoint. Consider that many of the crew who worked on site had to be paid, fed, and even housed, and you'll get a good idea of how big this film really was. According to co-director Joe Russo, in the featurette Beyond the Battle Wakanda, over 6,000 people worked on the film at one point or another, all collaborating to create over 3,000 shots. Of those shots, 2,900 required some form of visual effects in post-production, which meant that a portion of the Infinity War effects team had to add something to just about every second of the film. Influences. Obviously, the comics themselves had a major influence on the plot of Infinity War, but they weren't alone. Directors Joe and Anthony Russo are, of course, huge fans of cinema, and a number of different films are referenced throughout Infinity War. On the film's commentary track, the moment in which Ebony Maw is burned while attempting to steal the Time Stone is a nod to Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. A later scene in which Maw tortures Strange with needles is a reference to Marathon Man, while during interviews around the film's release, the Russos also highlighted a number of crime films as influences on Infinity War's heist-like elements, including Out of Sight and 2 Days in the Valley. Room for improvisation. As massive as it is, Infinity War required incredible amounts of planning and structuring in order to properly execute the script on screen. Despite that, however, the filmmakers still found room for a little improvisation along the way.
For the record, this was my plan. It was a nice contribution by Mr. Pratt.
In Beyond the Battle, Wakanda, the filmmakers note that the Black Panther cast were performing the Wakandan war chants off-camera as a way to warm themselves up for the action. The Russos heard the chants and decided to incorporate them into the film. Not all of the new additions came from the cast though. On the commentary track, the filmmakers noted that Rocket, referring to the Outriders as space dogs, came from one viewer who called the creatures that name during a focus group discussion after an early test screening. They thought it was funny and added it to Bradley Cooper's dialogue for his Rocket recording sessions. The living and the dead. Infinity War ends with one of the most devastating gut punches in cinematic history, a montage spanning 2 planets showing us the deaths of numerous Marvel favourites, including Spider-Man, Star-Lord, Scarlet Witch, Black Panther, and eventually even Nick Fury.
Oh no. Mother.
It feels like a huge loss, but this is only a tiny portion of the devastation Thanos inflicted with his snap. Remember, we're talking about half of all life in the universe here, which means half of anyone you've ever seen, loved or hated in an MCU film or series. Naturally, the filmmakers also made sure to keep track of which characters survived and which disintegrated off screen. On the survived side, you've got Howard the Duck, Spider-Man's Aunt May, and Shuri and Nakia from Wakanda. On the snapped side, there's the Incredible Hulk co-star Betty Ross, the Asgardian Lady Sif, and, as we later learned, thanks to Ant-Man and the Wasp, Hank Pym, and Hope and Janet Van Dyne. Of course, it is a safe bet that none of them will be gone for too long.